That is how long the United States Air Force has rotated bombers through a single atoll in the Indian Ocean without a single public announcement of a drawdown, a reduction, or a gap. The atoll is Diego Garcia. Coordinates 7 degrees south latitude, 72 degrees east longitude. The nearest coastline is 1,000 miles in every direction. From that position, a B-2 Spirit or a B-21 Raider can place a weapons payload on a target inside mainland China, inside the Strait of Hormuz and on the East African coast, inside a single sortie envelope, without crossing a meter of airspace that requires a foreign government to say yes. Pull back to the open ocean horizon and the geometry becomes visible. A carrier defense screen is not placed randomly. It goes where doctrine demands. The base that makes that placement possible is the one that never appears on a congressional hearing screen, never draws a camera to its runway, never sees a news crew on its pier. The question is not whether Diego Garcia matters. The question is why it matters more than any other node in the entire Indo-Pacific posture, including Guam, including Anderson, including the EDCA sites in the Philippines that get all the headlines. The answer is in the range triangle. Once you see the triangle, every other basing decision in the theater reads differently. The chessboard visible on that radar scope has been arranged for decades. Most cameras point at the pieces moving on the edges. The piece anchoring the center sits on a coral runway in the middle of the ocean, and it rarely appears on anyone's screen. If you want the geometry behind the headline instead of the headline itself, subscribe to Blue Water. To understand Diego Garcia, you have to understand what the United States was trying to solve in 1966. The Cold War posture in the Indian Ocean was thin. The Soviet Navy was beginning to project into waters where the U.S. had no permanent anchor. The British Indian Ocean Territory, a collection of atolls in the Chagos Archipelago, offered something rare, deep water anchorage, a runway long enough for strategic bombers, and a location so remote that no regional power could threaten it with conventional force. The legal foundation was a 50-year lease, signed and later renewed, running to 2036. Watch the arrested landing gear slam onto the angled flight deck. That is what operational certainty looks like. The lease expiry is the first unresolved variable. Mauritius and the UK reached a preliminary return agreement. As of August 2026, it sits in a holding pattern, visible on no radar scope, resolved by no handshake. The legal status of Diego Garcia is contested. The aircraft on that deck are not. The United States has invested continuously in the facility for 6 decades. The runway stretches 12,000 feet. The anchorage holds a full carrier strike group. The Naval Support Facility hosts a maritime prepositioning squadron, cargo ships loaded with equipment, ammunition, and vehicles needed to sustain a Marine Expeditionary Brigade for 30 days without resupply from the continental United States. That is not forward presence. That is a war-fighting reserve positioned 2,800 miles from the Strait of Hormuz, 3,800 miles from the South China Sea, and 4,000 miles from the Chinese coast. The people who built this base understood something that took the rest of the strategic community decades to articulate. Access is the first casualty of a crisis. When a regional government comes under diplomatic pressure from an adversary, the first thing it restricts is basing rights. Not trade, not diplomatic relations, basing. The historical record on this point, from the Suez Crisis forward, is unambiguous. Diego Garcia was engineered to remove that variable entirely. Here is where the geometry gets uncomfortable. Every other bomber operating base in the Indo-Pacific theater has a problem that Diego Garcia does not. Anderson Air Force Base on Guam sits 1,800 miles from Taiwan. That puts it inside the medium-range envelope of China's DF-26 anti-ship and land attack ballistic missile. The DF-26 has a reported range of 4,000 kilometers. Guam is within that radius. The Chinese military has publicly called the DF-26 the Guam killer. That is not propaganda. It is an acknowledgement of a geometric fact. Guam is the most capable bomber node in the Pacific. It is also targetable from the Chinese mainland on day one of a conflict. RAAF, based Tyndall in Australia's Northern Territory, is outside the DF-26 envelope. Range to the South China Sea from Tyndall is approximately 2,500 miles. A B-52 with aerial refueling can cover that distance. A B-2 can cover it without refueling, but operating from Tyndall requires Australian political authorization. Australia is a treaty ally. It is not a sovereign extension of American strategic authority. A phone call from Beijing to Canberra at the wrong moment creates a diplomatic variable that does not exist at Diego Garcia. The same logic applies to the EDCA sites in the Philippines. Clark Massa, Antonio Bautista, all closer to the South China Sea, all closer to Taiwan, and all requiring Manila's consent on a site-by-site, mission-by-mission basis. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is a real capability. It is also a political instrument that a Filipino administration can adjust, restrict, or revisit. Diego Garcia requires nobody's consent. The lease is with London. The facility is American-operated. The airspace above the atoll is effectively uncontested. When a B-2 takes off from Diego Garcia, it does not need to file a diplomatic notification. It files a flight plan. That distinction is everything. Most people look at the Indo-Pacific map and see Guam as the center of American power projection. The strategic read is more precise than that. Guam is the visible node. Diego Garcia is the survivable one. The bomber rotation record at Diego Garcia over the past 24 months reflects this logic in operational terms. B-52 Stratofortresses from Barksdale and Minot have maintained a near-continuous rotational presence. B-2 Spirits from Whiteman Air Force Base conducted confirmed deployments in 2024 and 2025. The specific sortie numbers are classified. The pattern is not. This is not a training rotation. A B-52 does not fly 8,000 miles from Louisiana to an atoll in the Indian Ocean to practice. It flies there to be positioned. The crews rotating through Diego Garcia operate under a tempo that commercial satellite imagery has captured in fragments. Aircraft on the ramp in configurations that indicate weapons loading. Tanker assets pre-positioned on the southern taxiways. Ground support equipment staged in patterns consistent with sustained high sortie operations rather than periodic presence. The imagery does not reveal mission specifics. It reveals readiness posture. And the readiness posture at Diego Garcia over the past 2 years has been consistent with a facility that expects to generate combat sorties on short notice, not one cycling through routine deterrence patrols. What is most surprising about this basing pattern is not the frequency. It is the geometry it reveals when you overlay the range rings. From the carrier deck, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye climbs out and begins its orbit. Its radar arc reaches toward the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the East African coast, the Indian subcontinent, the Andaman Sea. Extend that arc further, across the full South China Sea, up through the Taiwan Strait, reaching toward naval shipyard construction on Hainan Island. That is the coverage envelope a single base in the central Indian Ocean places inside reach of carrier-launched aircraft and long-range maritime patrol. A B-2 has an unrefueled combat radius of approximately 6,000 kilometers. A B-21, which entered operational service in 2025, is publicly assessed to have a similar or extended radius with improved fuel efficiency and a lower radar cross-section. Both aircraft, operating from Diego Garcia, can reach the primary strategic nodes of both theaters where American deterrence is most stressed, without aerial refueling, without transiting a choke point, and without overflying a third country. China has no island that does the same to America. Beijing has no basing node in the Indian Ocean. The People's Liberation Army Navy has port access arrangements at Gwadar in Pakistan and Djibouti, where it operates an actual naval support base. Neither location hosts a bomber, neither commands the range geometry that Diego Garcia holds. The asymmetry is structural. It is not a product of current spending or current politics. It is a product of where the atoll sits on the map. Here is the part that rarely appears in public analysis. The range triangle works in both directions simultaneously. A sortie from Diego Garcia toward the Strait of Hormuz and a sortie toward the South China Sea share the same takeoff, the same tanker track if one is needed, and the same initial flight path through uncontested airspace over the Indian Ocean. An adversary monitoring Diego Garcia cannot determine from the launch vector alone which theater is the target. That ambiguity is a deterrent effect that cannot be replicated from Guam, where the geometry leaves no question about the intended direction of travel. Working through the operational geometry on this, one detail kept coming back. No other location on the map produces that dual ambiguity at this range. The atoll is in exactly the right place for a reason that has nothing to do with the coral. The prepositioning dimension adds a layer the bomber story alone does not capture. Maritime Prepositioning Squadron 2, homeported at Diego Garcia, holds the combat equipment for a Marine Expeditionary Brigade. This is not symbolic. This is approximately 16,500 personnel worth of vehicles, artillery, ammunition, fuel, and sustainment materiel, pre-positioned at a location from which it can reach the Persian Gulf in 4 to 7 days, the Strait of Malacca in 5 to 8 days, and a Philippine Sea conflict zone in approximately 10 to 12 days. Prepositioning solves the problem that airlift alone cannot. Airlift can move people. It cannot move a tank battalion in time to affect the first week of a conflict. The ships at Diego Garcia carry the heavy equipment that changes the ground equation before an adversary can consolidate a fait accompli. That logic drove the prepositioning investment in the 1980s. It drives the facility upgrades being funded in the current defense budget cycle. The DoD has allocated funding for runway repairs, fuel storage expansion, and communications infrastructure at Diego Garcia across fiscal year 2024, 2025, and 2026 budget cycles. The line items are in the public record. The aggregate figure across those 3 years exceeds $500 million. For a facility that generates no political headlines and no congressional testimony, that is a signal. Budget decisions in the Pentagon reflect operational priorities more accurately than any public statement. Nobody in Congress is holding hearings about Diego Garcia. That absence is itself information. The 2036 lease question is the variable that Beijing watches most carefully, because it is the one variable that geography alone cannot solve for Washington. On the carrier's island superstructure, duty officers track the latest diplomatic signals the same way they track a contact on the radar scope, watching, logging, waiting for resolution. A 2019 International Court opinion and a 2021 UN resolution both pointed toward Mauritius. Negotiations opened, a framework emerged. But as of August 2026, no final treaty has been signed, and the question of what happens to Diego Garcia under any sovereignty transfer remains openly contested. What is the actual strategic risk? The answer is more nuanced than the headline suggests. Mauritius has sought British and American security guarantees as part of any transfer arrangement. It has no strategic incentive to hand China a veto over an American military base on its territory. The leverage Mauritius holds over Washington is worth far more than any relationship with Beijing. But the ambiguity is real. A treaty that does not explicitly grandfather existing American basing rights creates a legal surface that a future Mauritian government could contest. What do you think? Does the 2036 pressure point represent a genuine strategic vulnerability, or is it a negotiating tool that both sides will ultimately resolve on terms that preserve American access? The answer matters more than most people watching this theater have calculated. The honest strategic assessment is that Washington is not treating 2036 as a genuine deadline. The facility upgrades being funded now extend infrastructure with a useful life of 20 to 30 years. You do not spend $500 million on a base you expect to vacate in a decade. Either the legal resolution is already understood in private terms that have not been publicly announced, or the United States is betting that the operational value of Diego Garcia creates pressure on any future negotiation that no Mauritian government can afford to ignore. Radar operators know this problem. 2 tracks, similar signatures, neither fully resolved. The sonar display screen shows a contact that could read 2 ways. Both interpretations are supportable, neither is certain. The upgrade program itself has not proceeded without friction. Engineering assessments conducted in 2023 identified significant coral atoll subsidence concerns affecting 2 of the primary taxiways. Structural repairs required coordination with British authorities over environmental compliance frameworks that apply to the territory. The work was delayed by approximately 8 months. It is now complete, but the episode illustrated a constraint that does not apply to Anderson or Pearl Harbor. Diego Garcia's physical infrastructure sits on a low-lying coral atoll in a region of rising sea levels, governed by a lease framework that layers British environmental law over American operational requirements. The engineers solved the taxiway problem. The broader atoll elevation question over a 50-year horizon remains open. Strategic planners do not publicly acknowledge this variable. It is in the engineering assessments. During the delay, contractor teams operating under restricted access protocols conducted baseline elevation surveys across the entire atoll footprint. The survey data, portions of which have been referenced in unclassified environmental compliance filings, indicate that the lowest lying sections of the operational area sit less than 2 meters above current mean sea level. The runway itself sits higher. The fuel storage infrastructure and several support facilities do not. That differential matters for long-range infrastructure planning in ways that the current upgrade cycle has not fully addressed. Here is a take that will probably generate some pushback. The United States has underinvested in Diego Garcia's political durability relative to its operational dependence on it. The facility receives less congressional attention than almost any other installation of comparable strategic weight. Guam generates legislation, hearings, and public debate. Anderson generates regular reporting. Diego Garcia generates almost none of these. The argument for that discretion is obvious. Drawing attention to the base's centrality also draws attention to its vulnerability. Operational security is served by silence, but political durability requires investment that silence does not provide. The Chagos sovereignty question festered for decades with inadequate diplomatic attention. The 2019 ICJ opinion did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a legal argument that was allowed to develop without sufficient American counterinvestment in the political relationship with Mauritius. A base this important to the deterrence architecture deserves more deliberate diplomatic maintenance than it has received. The signal that Diego Garcia sends to Beijing is precise in ways that other basing arrangements are not. China's anti-access area denial strategy, the architecture of DF-21D anti-ship missiles, DF-26 land attack ballistic missiles, and the expanding PLA Navy surface fleet, is designed to deny the United States freedom of action inside the first island chain. The logic of A2AD is to push American power back far enough that the cost of intervention in a Taiwan or South China Sea scenario exceeds the perceived benefit. Every base inside the A2AD envelope is a base that China's strategic calculus has already accounted for. Diego Garcia sits 4,000 miles from the Chinese coast. That is outside the current range of every ballistic missile in the PLA inventory that targets fixed installations. The DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missile can reach Diego Garcia. The DF-41 is a nuclear system. Using it against a conventional military base is a different category of decision than using a DF-26 against Guam. Diego Garcia is, in practical terms, outside the conventional A2AD architecture. Will Beijing develop a conventional long-range capability that closes this gap within the next decade? Comment yes or no. The answer determines whether the range triangle holds through the 2030s. The current assessment among open-source defense analysts is that the PLA is developing conventional hypersonic glide vehicles with ranges that could eventually threaten Diego Garcia. Eventually and could are the operative words. As of 2026, the atoll is outside the operational range of any confirmed conventional PLA system with the accuracy and payload to hold a hardened military installation at risk. That window does not last forever. The DoD knows this. The upgrade investment is partly a function of getting maximum utility from the window while it is open. But the deeper strategic logic of Diego Garcia is not about surviving a Chinese first strike. It is about what the base forces China to calculate before a first strike is ever considered. If Diego Garcia is in the fight, any Chinese decision to initiate conflict in the Pacific must account for a bomber force that can strike the Chinese coast from a direction that is not Guam, that is not the Philippines, and that requires no host nation political authorization to launch. The PLA's targeting solution for a Pacific conflict includes Anderson, includes the EDCA sites, includes Yokosuka. The targeting solution for Diego Garcia requires a category of weapon and a category of decision that moves the entire confrontation into a different domain. That calculus is a deterrent. The base does not deter by being indestructible. It deters by being expensive to attack in a way that escalates faster than any other node on the board. What this base reveals about the broader American deterrence doctrine is worth pausing on. The United States has spent the past 2 decades building visible forward presence. Guam, the Philippines sites, the rotational deployments in Darwin, the carrier presence in the South China Sea. That presence generates headlines and diplomatic signals. It is meant to, but the strategic architecture underneath the visible layer is built around survivable bases that do not require allies to say yes. Diego Garcia is the clearest example. The quiet investments are the structural ones. The base that never draws down is the base that tells you what the doctrine actually is. The prepositioning ships at Diego Garcia represent a specific strategic logic worth making explicit. The Marine Corps equipment aboard those vessels is not there for a Diego Garcia scenario. Diego Garcia is not a contested environment. The equipment is there because prepositioning cuts the deployment timeline for a Persian Gulf or Indo-Pacific response by weeks. In a scenario where a rapid commitment of ground combat power into a Gulf contingency is required, the ships at Diego Garcia can be ordered to move before a final diplomatic decision is made in Washington. They can be at sea, in transit, before a president has signed an authorization. That timeline compression is part of the strategic utility of the base that never appears in the bomber discussion. One detail that stuck in working through the prepositioning logic, the Maritime Prepositioning Squadron Doctrine was designed in the late 1970s and early 1980s, specifically because planners concluded that a Soviet move into the Persian Gulf could outpace an American airlift response. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The prepositioning ships are still there. The doctrine they embody has been revalidated by every Goldwater-Nichols review and every QDR since. Some strategic decisions do not need to be revisited, they need to be maintained. The $500 million in current upgrade funding is, in part, an acknowledgement that Diego Garcia was designed for a threat environment that has changed significantly, and that the physical infrastructure has not kept pace with the operational demands being placed on it. The runway can handle a B-52, it can handle a B-2. Whether it can handle the sortie rates that a B-21 fleet would generate at wartime tempo is a question the upgrade program is answering in concrete and asphalt. There is a second-order consequence of the Diego Garcia geometry that Beijing has been adjusting to since at least 2015. If the United States can threaten both the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea from a single Indian Ocean node, then China's strategic planning must account for two-theater simultaneity, the possibility that an American commitment in the Gulf constrains the forces available for a Pacific contingency, but does not eliminate them, because the aircraft at Diego Garcia can serve both theaters on the same day. That simultaneity problem is one that China's current force structure is not fully equipped to solve. The PLA has invested in Pacific A2AD. It has invested in Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean presence, but the geometry of Diego Garcia means that an American force committed to a Persian Gulf scenario retains Pacific strike options that do not require repositioning assets from one theater to another. The aircraft are already in the middle. This is why the DoD has been quiet about Diego Garcia's strategic centrality, and why that quiet is now harder to maintain as the B-21 deployment patterns become visible in commercial satellite imagery. The base that reveals the doctrine is the base you cannot hide forever, the cold strategic assessment as of August 2026. Diego Garcia is the single most efficiently positioned military installation in the American global posture. It covers two high-priority theaters from a location outside the conventional threat envelope of both adversaries most relevant to those theaters. It requires no allied political authorization to operate. It holds prepositioning assets that compress response timelines for ground contingencies. And it creates a targeting dilemma for any adversary considering a first strike scenario, because neutralizing it requires a category of weapon and a decision escalation that exceeds the cost of any conventional objective it might be used to contest. The F-35B rolls into vertical takeoff from the carrier deck, a machine built for a world where basing assumptions hold, but those assumptions are under pressure on multiple fronts. The 2036 lease is unresolved. The Mauritius Sovereignty Framework has produced no final agreement. A coral atoll absorbs engineering investment but cannot be moved off a warming ocean. And on the sonar display screen, the emerging signature of PLA long-range ballistic systems, hypersonic glide vehicles, extended-range missiles, is closing toward a range envelope that Diego Garcia has never had to worry about before. The board favors the American position today. That position rests on a legal framework that runs to 2036, a physical infrastructure that is being upgraded faster than it is being threatened, and a strategic geometry that no amount of Chinese naval or missile investment has yet matched. None of those advantages are permanent. The base itself is not moving. The geopolitical ground beneath it is. The carrier strike group that moved into the South China Sea in early 2026 generated significant analysis. The ECA site activation in the northern Philippines generated more. Diego Garcia generated a budget line item and a runway repair and no congressional testimony. The geometry does not care about the testimony. The range triangle was the same before the press release and after it. That is the point. Power is not what you can announce. It is where you can stand and from where you can still reach, without asking anyone's permission. Diego Garcia is where America stands. The question the 2030s will answer is whether it can still stand there on terms Washington controls. For the next piece on how the prepositioning network connects Diego Garcia to the Persian Gulf math and what the AUKUS submarine basing arrangement in Perth changes about the Indian Ocean posture, that analysis is next on this channel.